thank you all for coming here and participating in this post-election discussion. I have to say, I think our initial intention was to have this kind of conversation much sooner after the election, just a couple of weeks out, and I think we might have had double the space. There was still, like, the counting was just getting over and so on, but I think there really hasn't been a big story other than how successful it's been. And I think people are ready to say, hey, this is great, it's been a success, and we're moving on. And I think that's real testimony to the success of the Minneapolis election. Again, I'm Jeanne Massey. I'm Executive Director of Fairvote, Minnesota. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization promoting election reform to make democracy work better. It's really exciting for me and a real honor to be here talking about the successful Minneapolis election after many years of having first adopted and then using it and then having it put to the real big test in Minneapolis and having gone so well. It's a thrill to be talking about it in this way, and we'll get into the details of that discussion tonight. There are many, many people in this room who have been a big part of making it happen, bringing it to Minneapolis, putting it into implementation in Minneapolis, and I want to extend my thank you to all of you. And a big thank you to Keith Libby and to Frederickson and Byron for hosting the event tonight. Keith, you've been a big battery in that engine, that train engine moving forward and pushing this reform forward, so thank you for all of your support. I want to acknowledge a few other people who have really helped make this election a big success. First, the City of Minneapolis, and Casey Carl will be here as a part of our panel tonight. The City of Minneapolis set out to create the gold standard for elections around ranked choice voting, and I think they accomplished their goal. So thank you for doing that. I also want to acknowledge the Minneapolis Foundation and the Joyce Foundation and other organizations that put a lot of money into the education process this year, not so that voters would only be engaged, but that they would be empowered by knowing that they should rank on their ballot and why that's important to rank. And that paid off in dividends. Voters went to the polls knowing very well what to do and felt very empowered by that choice and the ability to rank on the ballot. So thanks to the Minneapolis Foundation for sponsoring many, many community organizations, Fairvote, Minnesota included, in that grassroots education process. It paid off. Other key funders have been Target and Securing and Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Bill and Penny George. Thank you, Penny. Penny George is here. Carlin Peter, Ekdahl, Glenda Marilyn, Nelson, Kelly Doran, and some others. Without that kind of financial support, that kind of education process that we undertook simply wouldn't have been possible this year. And I also want to acknowledge the rock and roll really fantastic organizing team that we had this year to educate everybody. I won't name everybody in that process, but if you were involved in educating people this year, will you please stand up? Josh Nussbaum is here, who led the campaign and the communications team. There are many of you here, and you're not all standing, I can see. But thank you for all of your work. And then lastly, I want to acknowledge the media for the important role that they really took on and played this year. Without the media identifying the candidates, putting those issues out there, and being very good about educating voters about the process instead of complaining about it, it really helped the voters learn how to vote. And we'll see here in just a bit what voters thought about their experience on Election Day. But before they do that, I'm just going to feed you with a few statistics you may or may not already be familiar with, but when you see them and hear them again, you'll see why the election process this year turned out so well. Over if you ranked on the ballot. So it's very important that you rank. If your first choice is too weak to win, your vote can then transfer to your second choice and then your third choice. So by ranking, voters are empowered with that choice. And we educated that way in a very direct way. And in the end, with the good work of Fairvote, Minnesota and community organizations in the city of Minneapolis, voters ranked. 88% of the voters ranked in the mayor's race. 88% ranked at least two choices. 78% ranked three. Used up all their three options. That's phenomenal.
So explain this again. I'm not reading this right. So you're saying that under 20% only used their one.
They ranked one candidate on the ballot. The red bar represents how many people ranked 2 on the ballot. And the green bar represents people who ranked their 3 options, which is still remains very high. Phenomenal.
Red is actually 2 or 3.
No, I'm sorry. Red is just 2, and then 3 is how many people went on to mark yet a 3rd choice. This does not add up to 100.
But the red ones could have done 3.
Oh, sure. That's correct. They could have, that's correct. And of that red, the green subset is how many went on to actually mark 3. Right. So here's another way to look at it by precinct. You see that it goes all the way up to 100% and way above at the 90% line, most voters had ranked on the ballot at least 2 choices. That took a dip in a couple of places, and we're going to address that issue tonight in Ward 6, where there was a misleading strategy around voting for just 1 candidate. And we see the impact of that in the election. When you educate properly, voters know what to do. If that doesn't happen, we see that kind of impact. So I think that information is out there. We wanted to acknowledge it, and that did have a different geographic distribution.
This is on mayor?
This is on the mayor's race, that's correct. But I just want to point out again that across the city, with that exception, we see that high level of ranking.
Was that misinformation related to assumptions that the second choice is the group?
Now, we'll come into that in just a little bit in the panel discussion. We did an exit poll, Fairvote, Minnesota did. We hired Edison Research to conduct a very rigorous exit poll, so we're very confident in the results. And we found, like we did in 2009, but this was a bigger test of this finding, that voters found ranked choice voting simple to use. And not just all voters. So overall, 85% of voters found ranked choice voting easy to use. And all the subgroups, if you can see, while there's some variation, all of the groups understood ranked choice voting well, including 82% of voters of color, 81% of voters without a college education, 81% of voters who are 65 and older. This puts to the rest those critics who doubt that in communities of color and aging communities that people can actually learn how to rank their ballots. We knew they were wrong. We went into the education process out to prove that wrong, and that held true. So voters are savvy, and they figured that out. Not only did they find it easy to use, they like it. So what we know is that they want ranked choice voting here to stay. 68% of all voters want to continue to see ranked choice voting used in municipal elections. While not on the chart, an impressive 61% would like to see this go to a statewide initiative. We know that the more voters know about ranked choice voting, the more they like it.
Coming into it, I thought it was going to be kind of unnecessarily convoluted, but in practice it was dead simple.
It's actually very clear. There's 3 columns. You had to study a little bit, but I figured it out. It's pretty simple once you read through it. A lot less personal attacks.
It was less negative bashing.
I think that it makes candidates a little bit more stick to the issues.
Ballot was easy to use. Yes.
Very, very easy.
It keeps people more positive.
Less mudslinging. Definitely a more positive campaign as a whole. It was clear that candidates were aware that they had to appeal to their competitors' supporters as well, because they could be their second or third choice vote.
I think it definitely changed that. Yeah, it makes the election nicer.
I like this better because often I'm caught between a couple candidates that I would choose, so this is kind of a nice way of listing them all.
You could have 2 or 3 people that you wanted to vote on, and you could vote all 3 of them at the same time. So it was good.
It's choice voting. It's your choice, and you get 2 people to choose from.
If my first candidate that I choose somehow gets wiped out, my ballot does not go uncounted. I still have a voice.
Ranked choice voting gives citizens power, right? The more votes, the more options that we have, the more power we have
I like better having second and third choices. It's my first choice doesn't when somebody else that I was supportive of might have a chance.
They just give me more options. I feel like my voice is heard in a more nuanced way.
Keeps the campaigns more positive.
You felt that they all were trying to get your vote because they were it was more personable this time.
I like that it allows me to not feel as if I'm wasting my vote. Just because I'm not voting for the person that's spending the most money or is getting the most press.
It was really easy. The directions were really clear. It was easy to use. It was easy to do. I thought it was pretty simple.
I thought it was good. Again, you have choices. So you need to have choices.
I was expecting it to be a little bit more intimidating, but I guess you kind of set your mind for how it might look, and it was not a big deal.
It's, I think it's a pretty simple process. I mean, I think it's good that we get to rank our choices.
Fast, quick, and easy. Like, hey, a high school student can do it very easily.
Instead of slander and slamming your name, it was more, I'm coming into you to get to know you for the community.
It's more inclusive because we have more options, more choices.
I'm definitely in favor of ranked choice voting, and really proud to say that Minneapolis has adopted it.
That's validation of your gold standard, Casey Carl. That's excellent. Well, now we get to hear a whole lot more about the perspectives that went into this election. And I'll first introduce Lori Sturdevant with the Star Tribune as moderator and our panelists tonight, and we'll have a discussion. All of you have note cards and a pen, and if you've got a question, just raise your hand and a volunteer will collect that and bring it up to Lori as a moderator. I'll say up front that we'll go a little bit longer because we need to get started a little bit later. If you need to leave early, we understand that you have to depart. Lori Sturdevant is, it's a blessing that you're able to be here to moderate the discussion tonight. Lori has been a big part of this discussion ever since I can remember, ever since I've been around. I was a part of helping bring ranked choice voting to Minneapolis, and I remember getting a call from Lori back in 2006 and saying, Jeanne, I'm going to write an editorial. I need some information. And she's never stopped writing about ranked choice voting. In her columns, I'm suspecting she influences the way the editorials come out about ranked choice voting, which are largely highly favorable and promising about where this reform can take not just Minneapolis, but possibly the state of Minnesota. So thank you for your attention and diligence on this and your excitement for this kind of political reform here in Minneapolis and Minnesota. And thanks for being here to moderate tonight. On our panel, we have a number of perspectives, and I'm thrilled. And Casey, could you just grab a chair and perhaps put yourself on the end? Casey Carl, city clerk, I'll introduce him first, was not going to be able to make it tonight, but called at the last minute and said, I'm in. So I said, that's fantastic. He's got an important perspective for us to hear about the role of the city in implementing ranked choice voting this year. We also have on the panel, and I'll come around so I can see you all, go from right to left here. Mohamud Noor is a new school board director in Minneapolis. Congratulations on your new position. Also runs the Confederation of Somali Communities and was a core part of our grassroots education efforts in helping go door to door and to do phone banking and all those things to educate voters in the Somali community. That organization is one of many that played a role like that this election, and he can speak to that experience. We have Representative Steve Simon. Thank you for being here. Steve, probably the worst kind. Representative Simon is the lead author on our legislation to enable other communities to have the Minneapolis experience. And he is leading that charge, and now he is also a candidate running for Secretary of State, so he's got that perspective to bring to this discussion as well. Next we have a political scientist, Dr. Matt Filner, who is at Metro State University, who for 20 years has been studying the political process and dynamic and really analyzing what we need to do to create a better democracy. And he has a great depth of experience and perspective on this particular reform in particular, and I'm grateful that he can be here. Next we have Andy O'Leary, who was Mayor-elect Betsy Hodges' campaign manager. a big part of the change in elections is how the campaigns are run. And his campaign demonstrated the kind of campaign that needs to be run under ranked choice voting, and he's here to speak about that successful experience. And then lastly, we have Casey Carl, and I'm actually going to join the panel. You can lob me a few questions too. I think the other panelists are important to hear from, but we need a female up there in any case. Yes. I'm going to put myself up there, and Lori will be up here to bookend me on the other side. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy the discussion.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. This is a great crowd, and I don't think this crowd, after this warm-up, needs a lot of persuasion that ranked choice voting was one of the winners in this election. That was very clear. That was clear before some of the other results were clear, I think. But folks, the reporting I've done in the weeks since, I must tell you, in the state of Minnesota, there are still skeptics out there. There are a few, and tonight I think that we have an obligation, as we discuss this issue, to speak to some of those points of skepticism. I'd like to present the question tonight as an overall topic for us. Was it worth it? Because there was a lot of effort put into ranked choice voting. Jeanne, I'm looking at you when I say that. There was a lot of effort, there was a lot of money spent and time and energy spent on education. There was a lot of time and effort spent by Casey Carl in the city clerk's office to get the voting and tabulation done. And yet at the end, the emailer said to me, you know, we would have had the same results had we chosen had we run a plurality wins an old-fashioned election. That person, a skeptic, claimed that it really wasn't worth it to have gone through all this effort. What did we gain? We gained, high turnout was higher, but it was not as high as it was the last time we had an open seat mayoral election, which was 20 years ago. Spoiled ballots weren't so bad, but there were some to worry about, I suppose. The thing that I've heard most about is the suggestion that the campaign was actually too civil. That it was civil to a fault. There was a rather high place for elected official who thought that, had told me that. Difficult to discern the differences between the candidates as well. So tonight, let's speak to all of that. I have been told that Representative Steve Simon has another engagement, so since you're needing to run out the door, I want to put the question to you first. Was it worth it?
Yeah, first of all, thank you to Fairvote, Minnesota, and to everyone here for this forum. I think it's a very useful exercise. Yes, I think it was worth it. Now, I don't live in Minneapolis. I represent St. Louis Park and Hopkins. And I actually joke to my friends in Minneapolis that France Avenue is the barrier that protects me from being sucked into Minneapolis politics from time to time when I have no intention of being. But in all seriousness, as to ranked choice voting, I think it absolutely was worth it. I think the comments that you make, while valid points to make, don't address other things, like the tone of the campaign, like conditioning voters in Minneapolis and perhaps other jurisdictions to accept this system as legitimate, as producing an outcome that people welcome and have confidence in, piquing the interests of other communities I know that are out there, from Roseville to Red Wing, who are watching very carefully and very closely to see how this happened, not just in the broad level that we're discussing here, but in the technical level that Mr. Carl and others are well familiar with. So absolutely, it was worth it. And whether the result would have been the same mathematically or not really misses the point. This is a new way of voting that Minneapolis voters are now accustomed to, and that more people are finding more out about. And I think, in terms of traction at the legislature, I think this last election has helped and not hurt.
Okay, very good. And since you put on your candidate's hat here, what would the Secretary of State's role be in bringing this to pass in more places?
Well, first of all, let's keep in mind what the scope is right now. The scope, at least at the legislature and in state government, is not, or at least not yet, to bring this to a statewide kind of level. But it is to make sure that more jurisdictions can avail themselves of the advantages. Right now in Minnesota law, for a lot of reasons, there's a whole class of cities that don't automatically get the right to experiment with this. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Duluth, others can, others can't. So it's simply unshackling them and allowing them to do this. So the Secretary of State can do what the current Secretary of State has done, which is convene groups to standardize practices, so that you don't have one city doing ranked choice voting one way and another city doing ranked choice voting the other way. Secretary Ritchie, a number of years ago, convened just such a group, which I and others were part of, to figure out what best practices were, and I would imagine Mr. Carl and others who've now gone through these elections would have a great deal to say about how that can be done. But I think the Secretary of State, among others, can be a catalyst for that process.
Okay, well, thank you, and if you need to slide out, we understand it won't be anything to anybody's that. Thank you, okay. I'm turning next to Casey Carl. When you can speak to your counterparts in other cities around the country, in other cities in Minnesota, what are you going to tell them? Was it worth it?
You asked the question if it's worth it, and from my perspective as the administrator of the system, I have to say yes, of course, because the voters spoke in 2006 on quite a wide margin and said they wanted to do it. So from my perspective, it's not a question of was it worth it. We implemented the voters' decision. That's what we did. When I speak to counterparts in cities who are using or are interested in using an alternative methodology like ranked choice voting, the conversations inevitably steer to exactly what the Senator just said, and that is, how do you develop standards so that they're consistent from place to place, so that we can incentivize the marketplace, which develops our equipment, to take us seriously when we talk about building equipment that automates the processes. So that is where I think my colleagues and I are strongly focused right now, is taking it from just a local jurisdiction under a charter authority per se, and saying, no, these are the standards, these are the things we all can buy into and support.
Okay. I should mention that the audience does get to get involved in this conversation. You have been given, some of you, I hope all of you have been given little white cards. Feel free to write down a question. In a moment or two, I'll ask for those questions to be collected, and we'll get you involved in this conversation as well. Let me go with Andy O'Leary next. You obviously successfully navigated through the requirements of ranked choice voting to get Betsy Hodges into the mayoral-elect circle. Was ranked choice voting, your candidate would have been the mayor under the plurality wins rules, it appeared. She was ahead from the get-go. She would have a strong lead. Was it worth it to do the ranked choice exercise as far as you're concerned?
For sure. What Representative Simon said in terms of the results and what Jeanne said in terms of the results in terms of participation and the number of folks who ranked ballots, that was certainly worth it. But from a campaign perspective, I would say it was worth it because it made us run a campaign that we had to talk to more people. So there were more people participating and engaged in an election like this than normally would be under a traditional method. So from a campaign perspective and political perspective, being able to have additional conversations and having to have additional conversations was good for the campaign and good for the city.
And let me ask the professor, Dr. Filner, from a perspective of an academic who looks at these and how campaigns are run, did you detect that there was a change in tone that was a positive thing that was worth it in terms of keeping democracy as robust as we'd like it to be?
Well, I was struck when listening to the list of objections that you read, how similar those objections are to the objections that we've heard at every point in history against expansion of suffrage. So arguments against women voting, arguments against African Americans voting, arguments against people without property voting, have come down to those very kinds of arguments. They can't figure out the ballot. That they'll somehow affect the outcome in a way that's not healthy. Ranked choice voting, in my view, is simply about giving voters, and we heard this in the video, extra voice. And obviously from no voice to voice is a very important step, and that's happened over the kind of arc of history. Nelson Mandela died today, and it's sort of important to think about the connections between those who have been denied the right to vote. So that's the first key point I would make, is that this is simply expansion of democracy, and ranked choice voting is essential in that regard. It's not the only system in the world that expands democracy, but it's one of the leading ones. And the second is about legitimacy. So if Mayor-elect Hodges had been elected under the past system, she would have been elected with a plurality. And the majority of voters in Minneapolis would not have voted for her. And as a result of ranked choice voting, in fact, a majority feel like she was their choice and feel a legitimate sense that the outcome reflected the voice of the majority of the people. And there's a huge difference, I think, between, and I think we're seeing this all across the country as our democracy faces deep concerns about legitimacy, that what can we do to make our elections more legitimate? And this is one of the most key ways, in my view. And in that regard, it really didn't matter who won. It matters that whoever won was a legitimate winner.
All right. Mohamud, Noor, thanks for being with us. It was clear that there were, in some precincts in the Somali neighborhood, there was a real dip in the use of the rankings that were available on the ballots. Did people there think that ranking wasn't worth it?
Well, good evening, but the strategy of the candidate really matters. If a candidate decides that they're going to educate the voters to do the bullet voting, whereby your only given choice is to vote for one candidate, that is the message that you will encounter when you're educating the voters about the ranked choice voting. So the strategy that a candidate adopts, when they know exactly they have got the base or the support of the individuals who are going to vote, the outcome is as it was in Ward 6. So particularly if you have got someone who wants to influence the process, let me just say this. If you are a strategist in terms of how people should vote, in terms of ranked choice voting, you'll be making more money now. Because nobody could find someone who can educate the voters, at the same time inform the candidates how they can utilize the ranked choice voting. So this was more intimidating to the candidates than the electorate. So they didn't want to lose that opportunity, and that the result is as is, you can tell from the picture.
Jeanne, you haven't been involved in this way with the conversation. How do you react to these comments that suggest, the more negative comments that I said at the beginning, that suggest that this was not worth it, that the results would have been the same without ranked choice voting?
Well, I like the charge that it was too civil. I think we welcome that claim. What ranked choice voting has so miraculously done in Minneapolis has changed the game entirely. I like to call it BYOB politics. Bring your own, beyond your own base politics. That's what this is about. All of the candidates had to reach way beyond their base to win. And most did it, only one could win, but most still did it. There were no voters that didn't count in a strategy for mayor or for council members. It means that that the winning candidate is the person who appeals to and is supported by that wide range of voters and that broad coalition. It requires candidates to build the broad coalition of support in order to win and to remain in office. So we will see what this means for governance, but we anticipate that this will begin to change the dynamics of how elected officials govern in their community. And that's very important. And to Mahmoud's point, we know that campaigns certainly have a learning curve as well along the way of campaigning differently under ranked choice voting. But I would say the numbers show that most campaigns successfully did that this year. And kudos to the campaigns for having done that. Not all. And I think in Ward 6 in particular, that didn't happen with that candidate. But I think overall, that was true. And I want to recognize one candidate who is here, council member-elect, Nene Palmisano, who successfully won her campaign in Ward 13 to replace Betsy Hodges. And she won in a competitive five-way race with the support of second and third choice votes. And so hopefully we can hear from her tonight as well about what that meant at a local campaign level. We elected not just a mayor, although that seems to be the big focus, but 13 new council members and new park board members and members of the Board of Estimate and Taxation. It's a big election, and there was more happening than just the mayor's race. So all told, yes, I think this election has proven that we can go beyond traditional politics very successfully, and it matters a lot. We don't know if the candidates who won would have won, because if we think about bringing back that old primary, who knows who would have prevailed in the primary with maybe 5% of the voters turning out to make that decision? Who knows? And then we don't know what would have happened, the casualties created because of assault campaigning and attack campaigning in the general election. We feared, especially in the mayor's race, a big attack if it had just gone head-to-head. That's been the tradition in Minneapolis mayoral politics. That didn't happen. So who knows what the outcome might have been, actually.
I'd like to probe with Andy a little bit more about the thinking that inside a campaign that has this ranked choice imperative ahead of it. Did you have trouble deciding what messages would be acceptable to those second and third choice voters?
It wasn't so much the message, it was how do you talk to them about the second and third place votes. When you talk to somebody who is supporting another candidate, like how do you switch from, okay, well, that's great that you're supporting them, can I talk to you about Betsy Hodges? And that's where having a conversation both about ranked choice voting and a candidate persuasion conversation came in, and the decision that we made early in the campaign of focusing on field, focusing on second and third choice votes came in. So by the time that the fall came around, we had volunteers and staff who were used to asking for second place votes, knew how to do the pivot, and we'd been through months and months of trial and error, frankly, because it took a lot to get to a place that was a successful asking for second and third place votes in a way that that would work on election day.
And the asking was done mostly one-on-one, not with mass media, retail rather than wholesale, right?
Well, by the Hodges campaign, it was all one-on-one because we didn't have the mass media.
Well,
but yes.
If Steve Simon were here, I would ask how he thinks that kind of thing translates to a statewide campaign, where mass media would be certainly part of the equation. It's something I'd be interested to cover.
I mean, one thing I would say to that is it shows the most important piece of a campaign when it comes to ranked choice voting is the one-on-one, and making sure that you do that right and making sure you do the field operation right, and then you build on top of that. We had many opportunities in our campaign to shortchange the field operation and reallocate resources to media, and we, at each of those places, we decided to reinvest in one-on-one conversations versus running a less than top flight field operation and putting it in media. So we just continue to invest in the one-on-one conversations because we saw the results on a daily basis. We saw the results of one-on-one conversations with voters.
Let me ask the staffers to pick up those question cards now, so we can get this audience into the conversation. I see some hands ready to do that. Very good. Casey, Carl, talk to us a little bit more about the time that it took to get results, which was maybe just one day longer than we expected when you gave us all we in the press corps that briefing, but one day is a lot for some of these nervous editors. And candidates, that's right. What can you tell us about that counting process and whether we've reached optimal streamlining yet?
So the city's ordinance around ranked choice voting that talks about tabulation talks about allowing us to eliminate those who are mathematically impossible to defeat. But with this many candidates on the ballot, what you saw in the initial results on election night where there were so many candidates whose spread was so thin, we had to go through, I think it was the first 13 or 14 rounds only got us through 1% of the vote, of the total vote. But again, under the ordinance, to respect everyone's preferences and everyone's choices, you had to take that process. It was not possible for us under the ordinance to arbitrarily draw a line in the results and say everything below here we just won't count. There was pressure, obviously, for us to do that. You know, mathematically, come on, Casey, look at the results. You know they can't. Yes, I agree, but I can't. The ordinance says this. I can only do it if it's impossible for the person in the lowest place and the next person to not go forward. And we just didn't have that happen. It was an unfortunate reality, but we were not able to just arbitrarily say, don't count those people. And what would that have been saying to those voters? So we had to go through the painful process of going through round by round by round tabulation, and that goes to the earlier point about without software that automates that process, our best process to be transparent and to produce an audit trail that could be reproduced if necessary under a challenge or after the fact was to look at every vote and to process that individually, which took, actually after election night, 2 full days. In 2009, it took us 20 plus days. So we made a major improvement from 2009 to 2013, but I do understand and appreciate that voters and candidates and campaigns and media and everyone wants to turn on the 10 p.m. news on election night and we have a winner. And we weren't able to do that this year, but I think we had demonstrated a significant improvement from 2009 to this year.
Well, there was a newspaper editorial that suggested that perhaps there could be some kind of a threshold in law, in the ordinance, that allowed for some candidates to be automatically, to have to go directly to a second ballot, a second choice early on. You're nodding your head like that might work. Say a few words about that possibility.
Nope, don't know that would work. Nodding my head. Yeah, I read that editorial. But it just was not possible under the ordinance that we had. And yes, I have talked to editorialists and reporters and citizens and candidates who say, could you amend the ordinance to prescribe that if the election were to turn out in a similar fashion in the future, you would just arbitrarily draw that line, eliminate below that and move forward. That's a policy decision. I'm not a policy maker. The policymakers could make that decision. I would argue against it only on the basis of we would be arbitrarily drawing a line, and what does that say to the voters who participated, who engaged, who ranked their choices, even if those choices were at the bottom of the threshold. So if the process of ranked choice voting is to engage more voters and to allow more people to express preferences, I think that arbitrary decision actually is counterproductive to the very premise of ranked choice voting.
There was one other ordinance change that came to mind in those last weeks, the campaign, looking at Jeanne, concerning the filing fee. Would you like to say a few words?
There isn't anyone in this room I haven't had a long conversation with, but probably the longest with Casey. I think there's a general consensus that the City Council probably erred in not changing that filing fee before Election Day, and has the opportunity now moving forward to make that change. It simply stands to reason that there should be some threshold that demonstrates the candidates intend to mount a campaign. So I think the proposal moving forward would be something like $500 or 500 signatures in order to appear on the ballot. That would have truncated the ballot, my guess is, by 75%. It would have made a big difference all the way through the process.
Here's a question concerning how ranked choice voting affected competitive city council races. And I'm looking at Mohamud because I know you were close enough to what was going on in Ward 6 that you might have a perspective on that. What have you learned about ranked choice voting's impact on the city council? And what do you expect will happen going forward with that?
I think in competitive races, some of them, we have got an example of a member-elect city councilman. It's nervous. The candidates become very nervous, not knowing what will happen. How did the individual vote? So it encourages more people to participate in the process. So it gives the candidates the opportunity to talk to each and every person that they can talk to in their wards. So for Ward 6, when you have got two candidates who are running, and you know obviously there will be some clashes and so many other things. Everybody's trying to compete for their base and make sure that they can get the most out of the vote. The ranked choice voting will have been the best if we will have explained to the individuals that if you select your first number one choice, it's not going to impact your second choice. And that message wasn't clear to so many people that your number one choice will not affect your second choice as long as your first choice stays in the race. So that's a message that we need to move forward with and inform the public, continue with the education. I think we started very late. If we can start from the beginning and continue with the work that is being done by Fairvote, I think it will be more beneficial to the public and in our democracy.
Casey, it's maybe not a surprise that a number of these questions are concerning, again, the technical process. That one or extra day or 2 extra days of delay really irritated apparently more than journalists and campaign managers. Is the software part of the fix? Was that part of the problem that you had with that?
Yeah, so it's a very larger problem, and I'll try and be brief on this. There is no certified voting system on the marketplace. None. Zero, zip, nada, that automates the process of tabulating ranked choice voting ballots. Part of that is a federal level issue. The federal level has the Elections Assistance Commission, which sets the standards under the 2002 Help America Vote Act. They're the federal body charged with developing standards that we have to meet in terms of certifying voting equipment that can be used in the state of Minnesota. Those members, the commissioners on the EAC, are appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. Now, given the reality of Washington, D.C., we have not had an EAC for many years. The last time the EAC adopted voting system standards was 2005. When did we adopt this process here?
In 2006.
So there are no federal standards that even talk about alternative voting systems, because the last time the federal level body that got in charge of standards met and had the ability to produce standards was 2005. The equipment we bought in 2013 was certified to the 2005 standards for the federal government. So that's a problem for us at the local level. Then the other thing is that under Minnesota's election law, not only do you have to get that federal certification, you've got to come get state certification. And the state has no standards for ranked choice voting. You recall that Mr. Simon said, it'd be nice if we had some uniform standards. Yes, it would, because that would help us incentivize the marketplace to produce this equipment for us. So with those two major hurdles, there is no equipment available to us. It just simply does not exist that we can use in the state of Minnesota, because our election law in this state, unlike some states, says that any voting system used for counting ballots has to meet and comply with both federal and state certification levels. There are other states that don't say that. Other states are a little bit more lenient. And they say, well, those federal standards, we consider those guidelines. So they have more leeway than we do here in Minnesota. In Minnesota, they're not guidelines, they are requirements. So with those two major hurdles, we have no choice except to use, I mean, this year we didn't do a hand count because we were able to work with our vendor to at least export a data file out of those machines. And that was as close as we could come to automating the process, is that they would give us an exportable data file that we could tabulate using Microsoft Excel. What that did was essentially eliminate 3 processes from the 2009. In 2009, there were 6 steps to process every ballot, right? There were 3 this year because of that exportable data file. And the 3 that we are eliminating were hand sorting, hand counting, and hand data entering into an Excel spreadsheet in the end. So we were able to export and go right to that process. Those are the most expensive pieces and time consuming: hand sorting, hand counting, and hand data entry. So that's why we didn't have 20 days, we had 3. That's why we didn't have the same level of cost and expense and timeline. But I hope I've answered that question about why there is no equipment on the marketplace. It's a bigger issue than just the state. This is a federal issue, it's a state issue, it's election law issue, it's the fact there are no standards around alternative voting methodologies at either the state or federal level, and that we are burdened with following those laws.
Dr. Filner, yes.
Yeah, given the audience, the support for ranked choice voting, I kind of sense from the number of questions that there's sort of a defensiveness about it being inefficient. And I would just point out that there's a very efficient way to get a new mayor. We could simply appoint someone, or we could have one candidate on the ballot. And democracy is inefficient, and more democracy is more inefficient. And so while we certainly should try to automate it as much as possible, the delay is about giving voters more voice. And so, there are cities all across the country. Only a few have ranked choice voting, but there's all kinds of experimental alternative systems of voting. And the fact that the federal government is so far behind in dealing with establishing some universal standards is a Washington problem. But we shouldn't feel, I don't think, defensive about the fact that it took an extra couple days. We should embrace the fact that this is more voice, and that the delay is about more democracy.
Dr. Filner, it came on to those thoughts. One of the questioners is interested in knowing more of a national perspective. In what states did ranked choice voting begin, and when? Do states still use it? I know the answer to that, no states use it. But what is the national picture? Where are there pockets of interest in this?
Well, Jeanne could probably speak to the few cities that have it, right?
San Francisco,
Oakland.
4 in the Bay Area, San Leandro as well, and Berkeley, thank you. And 11 cities in total now use it, big and small. Portland, Maine included, so from the Bay Area to Portland, Maine. But there are a dozen others waiting implementation. And there are many more cities that are kind of wanting to go in this direction.
And the temptation is to assume that because we have a winner-takes-all system in all states and in most jurisdictions, that we have always had such systems. And in fact, over the course of American history, we've had dozens of different kinds of systems to elect people. In Connecticut, there's cities that have elected people in a very unique system where actually you're given a number of votes as there are a number of candidates. So in Minneapolis, there would have been actually 35 votes, and some voters can put 35 votes in a pool of 1 candidate, or maybe they put 5 votes in each of 7 candidates. There's a variety of different systems globally and nationally that can be implemented, and we actually just have a tradition in the United States of using winner takes all, and that tradition has as many alternatives as commonly used. And so the ranked choice voting isn't somehow revolutionary in my view. It's part of a historic trend to increase capacity for citizens to be involved in democracy. And the barriers exist, but mostly they're historic barriers about tradition and about, as I mentioned earlier, about assumptions of who could, quote, handle voting. And as those are broken down, I think it will expand.
This is an audience that's very interested in ranked choice voting's expansion, and a number of our questions are about how do we get this to the state level. And I'd welcome any of you to chime in. Certainly Jeanne has been working on this, but what are some of the barriers to statewide adoption, and how do we, one of the questioners says, get past the notion that this is all a DFL game? How do we get Republicans into the act? Jeanne, you want to start with that?
Sure, and I'll start by saying that Minnesota is really a leader in this reform at a potentially state level. While it's happening in cities across the country, there are not any states that are working toward a statewide initiative, and Fairvote, Minnesota, the state of Minnesota is. We don't believe that it's possible to get there without making sure that we understand it, embrace it, and demonstrate its success. That's why the importance of the local level successes are so critical. That doesn't mean we're doing it at the local level just because we want to demonstrate success for a statewide initiative. It's so important that we use it at a local level in addition to our state politics. What this would offer us at a state level is a real solution to our divisive, polarizing politics. For the reasons we've talked about tonight, is that it really requires candidates to go way beyond their base to appeal to and represent the voters. That changes everything about how they campaign and how they govern. It can be a real solution to our political dysfunction at a state level. How do we get there? Again, continue at the state level. We have our enabling legislation with the help of all of you. Contact your legislators, make sure that they're supportive of a local enabling bill. It's simply a local bill to empower the communities to use it. It doesn't require anything of anybody. So it should be a bill that passes fairly simply, and it provides those standards that Casey was talking about. That's very important. The political barriers are going to be, I believe, the more successful this is, the more that there's going to be some pushback by those who have long been a part of really kind of controlling and processing elections the way we always have. So those resistors of change we've been dealing with now for a long time, and that may grow as we move toward a statewide initiative. The argument that this tends to be a DFL-flavored kind of reform, I think has its roots in the fact that it began in cities dominated by Democrats, in Minneapolis and St. Paul. But let me say that there are many Republicans and independents interested in this kind of reform for the same reasons everybody else is. The fact that it formally tends to have that kind of support is explained by the fact that it began here, but there's a great deal of interest across the political spectrum, and we have that kind of public support moving forward. We need to make sure that we continue to educate and demonstrate and build that kind of constituency support and ultimately legislative support for a statewide initiative.
Any other comments about how we continue to grow with this, Dr. Filner?
Well, a couple things. First, the Republicans actually use ranked choice voting. They may not think of it as ranked choice voting, but in both party conventions, right, when there are multiple candidates running for endorsement, there are actually multiple ballots, and each time the voters get to choose a second choice if their candidate is knocked out. So they understand that, just as Democrats do, and so I think that... Of course, I'm not saying that's identical. It's not instant either, but they understand the notion that after your chosen first choice is eliminated, that your second choice should have a voice. So I think that can be used to make inroads with those who oppose it. Secondly, the 3 congressional districts in the state which have the highest voter turnout are the 2nd, 3rd, and 6th, which obviously are the Republican strongholds in the state. The rest of the congressional districts actually have lower turnout on a per capita basis. So their concern, of course, is that ranked choice voting will somehow increase turnout in places that are more Democratic based, and I think that's kind of a key issue we have to face. And the third thing, in terms of a barrier, there's of course a huge difference between ranked choice voting when there are multiple candidates and ranked choice voting when there are 2 candidates or even 3 candidates, where the significance, it diminishes the fewer the candidates there are. And so part of the argument for why it needs to expand statewide is that we need a broader pool of candidates in any given race. And there's resistance. There are those people who are opposed to democracy. who want less democracy. There are efforts to limit access to the ballot, and this would, in my view, expand access to the ballot.
I'm going to give Andy O'Leary the last word. Are you eager to do this again? And what advice would you have for what advice would you have for another campaign manager trying to run in a ranked choice voting environment?
Well, of course, I mean, I'd love to do it again. I'd love to do any campaign again. That's why you do this and hope you win so you get the next job. But in terms of advice for the next campaign manager in ranked choice voting, keep it simple. I'm lucky that I've never been accused of overthinking a problem, but really with ranked choice voting, you can outthink yourself. And over at the Hodges campaign, we just kept it pretty simple. Ask for a first choice. If you don't get that, ask for a second choice. If you don't get that, ask for a third choice. And if you don't get that, well, move on to the next person. I mean, it really is, keep it simple. That would be my advice to ranked choice voting campaign manager who's never done it before.
I think that's enough, folks. Thanks so much, and we're glad you came tonight.
I'll just take a moment to thank Lori and to thank the other panelists for the discussion tonight. I hope that was all a helpful learning experience for everybody, and thanks for taking the time. Just to summarize, really the goal of this forum was to bring about the discussions of the lessons we learned and the future of ranked choice voting in Minnesota. And as we know and as we saw and talked about tonight, the system isn't perfect. There are administrative improvements to make. There are still political challenges ahead of us, and we, of course, would like to see the filing threshold changed before next time. We'd like to see major advancements made toward tabulation software. It's a political advocacy issue, one that Fairvote Minnesota will play a role in. We don't accept the fact that it doesn't exist. We want to make it exist. That will be our role.